Can we settle down so that I can address my words to the Great One? Despite the many hours of praise and celebration deservedly heaped on our dear friend and comrade Eqbal Ahmad, there's still a great deal more to be said about him, and I flatter myself that I can at least try to say more. One of the most remarkable things about him is that even though he has crossed more borders and traversed more boundaries than most people, Eqbal is reassuringly himself in each new place, new situation, new context. This is not at all a matter of ethnic or religious identity, nor does it have much to do with the habitual stability we associate with solid citizens. It's rather that Eqbal's special blend of intellectual brilliance and courage, supernally accurate analysis, and consistently humane and warm presence make of him, to paraphrase from Kipling's Kim, a friend of the whole world. Let me give one example of the trust that he inspires and the care that he takes with his friends. 10 years ago, a former undergraduate student of mine who had become a rabbi rang me up and said that he wanted to talk to me about a very special proposal. He subsequently came to New York from Providence and informed me that a group of highly influential rabbinical figures who were well known in their support for Israel wanted to have a private discussion with me. I gathered that they too were puzzled about Palestinian intentions and more profoundly about the persistence of a Palestinian resistance to Israeli practices. Significantly enough, our meeting was to take place in the spring of 1987, a few months before the beginning of the Intifada. I had already been fairly involved in off-the-record and in some cases secret meetings with Israeli and American Jewish leaders, and was uncertain as how to proceed, since all our other meetings were both inconclusive and often futile. So great was the gap between us, as relatively independent Palestinians without much organizational power or support, and the much more estimable, well-established Jewish members with their dozens of organizations, privileged relationships with Israel, and so on. I had already, by that time, established Eqbal as my guru on matters political, a position which he still holds, by the way. And so the first thing I did was to call him and ask him whether I should have that meeting, and when he said yes, I asked him immediately to come with me. The thing about asking him for something is that you know in advance that he will either give or do it, and in this case, as in all others, he did. Although neither a Palestinian nor a previous participant in the meetings I've described, Eqbal had immediately stood out as the one person I could totally trust. Trust to be there, trust to tell the truth, to help guide me, to provide an additional credible voice. As we sat through the meeting, I recall marveling at Eqbal's extraordinary poise and calmness as he negotiated the challenges and provocations of what were, for me, pitfalls and traps that I kept falling into. And when at one point in the 3-hour discussion, one of the Jewish leaders said that even though he had made lots of speeches calling Arafat a terrorist and Hitler, he, this leader, knew that he wasn't telling the truth. Eqbal quietly and deliberately pointed out to him what unnecessary hypocrisy he had indulged himself in, something I could not say myself. One more story is worth recounting. Starting, as I recall, in the late 70s, I was able to invite Eqbal to Beirut, where he met Arafat and the other Palestinian leaders, who immediately recognized his skill and sincerity of analysis. It was in the summer of 1980, during the Lebanese Civil War, that having been introduced to Abu Jihad, who was assassinated in 1988, Arafat's colleague and the PLO's military commander in South Lebanon and elsewhere, Eqbal prevailed on Abu Jihad to let him go on a tour of PLO positions in South Lebanon. Eqbal did so, and a few days later produced a detailed report for them about his findings. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in essence, Eqbal predicted not only the fact of the Israeli invasion that was to take place 2 years since, in 1982, but he was also able, alas, to predict the result. It's not only the skill in military matters that impressed me, but that those leaders sensed about Eqbal that he was a real friend in the struggle and that his sincerity and commitment could not be gainsaid despite the fact that he wasn't a native. True, he has known how to exploit his own Asian and non-white provenance. I don't say this at all critically, but rather admiringly. And in the case of the Palestinians, they knew they were dealing with a fellow Muslim. But anyone who's had to do with Eqbal in conditions of struggle knows subliminally that his loyalty and solidarity need never be questioned. He's a genius at sympathy. When he uses the pronoun we, you know that he speaks and acts as one of us, but never at the expense either of his honesty or of his critical faculties, which reign supreme. This is why Eqbal comes as close to being a really free man as anyone can be. This isn't to say that he's indifferent to the problems of others, or blessed in that he doesn't have problems of his own. This is very far from true. But he does give one the impression that he's always his own man, always able to think and act clearly for himself, and if asked, for others. I suppose that it is especially true of Eqbal that his subcontinental origins in Bihar and Lahore have steeped him both in the travails of empire and of the many wasteful tragedies of decolonization, of which sectarian hatred and violence, plus separatism and partition, are two of the worst. Actually, there are four, but I thought I'd avoid the number. Yet, retrospective bitterness at what the white man wrought and communal hatred at what his fellow Indians and Pakistanis did are not and have never been part of Iqbal's response. How does he get over such feelings which so naturally occur in others? Partly, I think, because he has always been more interested in creativity than in vindictiveness, in originality of spirit and method rather than in mere radicalism. Remember, by the way, the title of one of his most spirited essays, the one on Régis Debray, which is entitled Radical but Wrong. Interested in originality of spirit and method rather than in mere radicalism, in generosity and complexity of analysis over the tight neatness of his fellow political scientists. In fact, it's only just as I'm saying these words that I recall with surprise that although Eqbal is a trained political scientist, I've never thought of him as one. When I dedicated my book, Culture and Imperialism, to him, it was, I realized, because in his activity, life, and thinking, Eqbal embodied not just the politics of empire, but that whole fabric of experience expressed in human life itself, rather than in economic rules and reductive formulas. What Eqbal understands about the experience of empire, therefore, is the domination of empire in all its forms, but also the creativity, originality, and vision created in resistance to it.
A man cannot be violent, incredibly violent to his mistress and sadistic to her, and be gentle to his wife. And a woman cannot be sadistic to her husband and be gentle to her child. These are organic linkages. There is a definite, present, and organic link between oppression abroad and ultimately the counter-revolutionary chickens abroad coming home. So one single thing I do want to say is that when we talk about problems at home, we must try to understand that they are organically linked. When you think about your lives, your alienations, let us not forget that they are deeply linked with American policies in the third world in particular and abroad generally.
Those words, creativity, originality, vision, are central to his attitudes on politics and history, and to them I should like now to turn. Among Eqbal's earliest writings on Vietnam is a series of papers on revolutionary warfare, which is intended as a refutation of standard American doctrine on the subject. U.S. counterinsurgency experts see in Vietnamese resistance a sort of conspiratorial, technically adept, communist and terrorist uprising, which, with superior weapons, clear-cut pragmatic doctrines about maneuvers and countermaneuvers, and the relentless deployment of overwhelming military force can be defeated. What Eqbal suggests is a different paradigm. The revolutionary guerrilla as someone with a real commitment to justice, someone who has the support of her or his people, and someone willing to sacrifice for the sake of a cause or ideology that has mobilized people. What counterinsurgency doctrine cannot admit is that the native elites, Bo Dai or the Diems, whose interests are congruent not with their country's interests but with those of the United States, are not the people to win a revolutionary war. In confronting the arch-theorist of this benighted view, none other than Samuel Huntington, who has recycled himself these days as a theorist of civilization, Eqbal put it this way. I quote, "In underdeveloped countries, the quiescence which follows independence is now giving way to new disappointments and new demands, which are unlikely to be satisfied by a politics of boundary management and selective co-optation, a fact which the United States, much like our ruling elites, is yet unable or unwilling to perceive. There's an increasingly perceptible gap between our need for social transformation and Americans' insistence on stability, between our impatience for change and America's belief in the possibility of achieving reforms under the robber barons of the Third World, our longing for absolute national sovereignty and America's preference for pliable allies, our desire to see our national soil freed of foreign occupation, and America's alleged need for military bases. As the gap widens between our sorrow and America's contentment, so will, perhaps, these dichotomies of our perspectives and our priorities. Unless there's a fundamental redefinition of American interests and goals, our confrontations with the United States will be increasingly antagonistic. In the client states of Asia and Latin America may even be tragic. In this sense, Vietnam may not be so unique. It may be a warning of things to come. What slowly emerges in these writings is the opposition between conventional and unconventional thought, and of course the even deeper opposition between justice and injustice. In his preference for what the unconventional and the just can bring peoples in the way of liberation, invigorated culture and well-being, Eqbal is firm and uncompromising. His distrust for standing armies, frozen bureaucracies, persistent oligarchies allows no exceptions. Most of Iqbal's writing is in some way inflected or directly influenced by his Indian and Pakistani experiences, but also and especially his Algerian experiences, which, given his elusiveness about dates, a reluctance to spend too much time talking about his own exploits, has led me to conclude was absolutely central for all his work. There's first of all the importance of the human factor and the necessity of out-organizing the enemy rather than simply out-fighting him. There's second the need to delegitimize the colonial or unjust authority and create parallel organizations to help the people live away from the usurper's power. Then last, perhaps most important, there's the need to transmute the structures of war into democratic and national institutions. No one has more trenchantly summarized the various pathologies of power in the Third World than Eqbal in the 3 summary essays he wrote some years ago for Arab Studies Quarterly. Once again, unlike many of the second thoughters and post-Marxists who populate the academic and liberal journals today, Eqbal remains true to the ideals of revolution and truer yet to its unfulfilled promise.
You know, I'm not a violent guy, I'm a very peaceful son of a bitch. I really am, basically. You know, I just sometimes am afraid that, we are forced into taking up guns and fighting. One doesn't want to do that.
To have heard him lecture over the years, passionately and sternly, about militarism in the Arab world, in Pakistan, in Algeria, and elsewhere, is to have known the high moral position he took on matters having to do with the sanctity and potential dignity of human life, either squandered or abused by strutting dictators or co-opted intellectuals. Creativity, vision, originality of the kind appreciated by Eqbal and his great friend Ahmad Faz, to whom he introduced me in Beirut 17 years ago, is the measure for political life. That, and not the trappings of honor guards, fancy limousines, enormously bloated and all-powerful, bureaucracies. The measure is the human being, not the abstract law, nor the amoral power. I think it must have been difficult to hold on to such ideals and principles. Most of Eqbal's written work, and indeed his activism, has taken place in dark times. Not only does he take full stock of the devastations of imperialism and injustice all over the globe, but in particular he has, more eloquently than anyone else, inventoried the particular sadness and low points reached by Islamic culture and states. Yet even then he manages to remind us that what he mourns is no mere religious or cultural fanaticism, as it is usually misrepresented in the West, but a widespread ecumenical movement. Moreover, though not an Arab himself, Eqbal has reminded Arabs that Arabism, far from being a narrow-based nationalism, I'll quote him here, is quite unique in the history of nationalisms because it tried to connect itself beyond boundaries. It came close to imagining a universal community linked by word and sentiment alone. كل من كانوا عربا في لغتهم وثقافتهم وولائهم فهم العرب. Anyone who is an Arab in his feelings, in his language, and his culture is an Arab. So a Jew is an Arab. A Christian is an Arab. A Muslim is an Arab. A Kurd is an Arab. I know of no national movement which defined itself so broadly. In such a situation and with such a heritage, Eqbal sees the degradation of ideas and values that grip Arabs and Muslims alike. Let me quote him again, this in the aftermath of the Gulf War in 1993. We live in scoundrel times. This is the dark age of Muslim history, the age of surrender and collaboration, punctuated by madness. The decline of our civilization started in the 18th century when, in the intellectual embrace of orthodoxy, we skipped the age of enlightenment. The decline of our civilization started in the 18th century when, in the intellectual embrace of orthodoxy, we skipped the age of enlightenment and the scientific revolution. In the second half of the 20th century, it has fallen. He continues, I have been a lifelong witness to surrender and imagined so many times, as a boy in 1948, a young man in 1971, and approaching middle age in 1982, that finally we have hit rock bottom. But the next time, even if we go down, we should be able to do so with a modicum of dignity. Fortunately, I did not entertain even so modest an illusion from Saddam Hussein's loudly proclaimed mother of battles. This on the one hand, and on the other, the multiple degradations of what he once called the fascism and separatism, quote, two clearly identifiable, seemingly hostile, but symbiotically linked trends in his Pakistan. The Bhuttos, Zia-ul-Haq, and their coteries plundered the land, demoralized the population. They tried to subdue the country's insurrectionary constituent cultures and failed, but at the price of more blood and treasure. And everywhere, as throughout the Muslim world, they provoked, if they did not actually cause, the rise of Islamism, which as a secularist Eqbal has always deplored. And for that, no Palestinian can ever thank him enough. I've seen him with our young people, with our leaders, with professionals, intellectuals, children, old people. There's never anything but affection and sympathy from him for them, and all of them. You can see it in her eyes. Cherish the man's courage, brilliance, and sheer downright humaneness. But what also needs mentioning is that the struggle for Palestine, as Eqbal has, is to have had none of the material or even intellectual rewards of the struggle. Palestine is a thankless cause, one in which if you truly serve, you get nothing back but opprobrium, abuse, ostracism. Eqbal has suffered all these. I've never had any doubt that his outspoken, uncompromising solidarity with us has cost him dearly, not only in hours and days and months of wasted effort, we seem to sink deeper every day, not only in the disappointments, the death, and disfigurements that have distorted our lives perhaps irremediably, not only the endless surrenders and humiliations, the failures of reason and planning, but also, and this must be emphasized since Eqbal himself will never say it, in the cost to him, in his profession, his career, maybe even in his writing. Palestine is the cruelest, most difficult cause to uphold, not because it is unjust, but because it is just, and yet dangerous to speak about, as honestly and as concretely as Eqbal has done. How many friends avoid the subject? How many colleagues want none of Palestine's controversy? How many liberals, bien-pensant liberals, have time for Bosnia and Chechnya and Somalia and Rwanda and South Africa and Nicaragua and Vietnam and human and civil rights everywhere on earth, but not for Palestine and Palestinians? Not Eqbal, though, to the embarrassment and shame of so many of his friends. He speaks, writes, and constantly brings the matter up, like a child who refuses to be cowed by adults and manages to blurt out the nasty family secret that everyone is trying to hide and hide from. For all this, my dear friend Eqbal, I and so many of us are grateful and will never forget what you have said and done. The beauty of it is that he has not merely been an unruly cheerleader or an uncritical enthusiast, but a sober, even somber critic of our struggle for self-determination. Never merely negative, but always ready with positive, sometimes ingenious and visionary suggestions, none of which, alas, were ever taken up, to our eternal discredit. Yet it's crucial to underline something else about Eqbal's involvement in the Palestinian struggle. I've always been impressed and often stunned by the delicacy and sensitivity of his attitudes towards Israeli Jews. I recall during that encounter I spoke about with the Jewish leaders that we lectured them on the fact that we are dealing with, as he put it, two communities of suffering. So Catholic and unrestrained are his capacities for understanding the travails of all peoples, that he has never descended either into conspiracy theories or downright anti-Semitism. On the contrary, there's always a kind of grave nobility to what he has had to say to and about Israeli Jews. And he's always conveyed that special scrupulosity of attention to non-Israeli Jews who might otherwise have bristled at the severity of his anti-Israeli critique. But to return to some of what, I'm sure many of you don't know these things, so I allow myself to tell you them. What over the years I've heard him say and have read in what he wrote. In the 1970s, he formulated the suggestion, an extremely brilliant one, quite in keeping with his general attitude of nonviolent aggressiveness, that the PLO should try to organize a march of Palestinians towards the Israeli borders in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Inspired perhaps by the great civil rights marches of the 60s, Eqbal urged Arafat and company to mobilize as many people as possible, walking unarmed to the borders with banners saying, "We want to go home." I remember the look on the leadership's collective face, if that's the right word for it, when I patiently explained Eqbal's proposal, the look of disbelief and mild panic, especially when I emphasized the need for peaceful means and disciplined organization. This was at a time when Eqbal was mercilessly critical of the cult of the gun, the misuse of slogans like armed struggle, and the creeping, ultimately debilitating militarism of Palestinian thinking and organization. A few years later, at a seminar convened in Beirut, especially to listen to Eqbal, he painstakingly propounded a strategy for mounting an organized campaign for Palestinian human rights in the United States, and how, in order to do that, we needed detailed information on every congressional district in the United States, on the workings of important civil institutions, Ahmad mentioned it, like the churches, colleges, labor unions, all of which could have been done with 1/10 the resources that were squandered on first-class air tickets and expanding bureaucracy and bottles of black label scotch. 10 years later, he repeated the same but more detailed argument to the exiled Palestinian leadership in Tunis with, I'm sorry to say, the same results. Arafat later told me, and I quote, "You and Eqbal have constantly been telling us that we should try to understand America. Well, I've appointed an America committee at the highest levels of the PLO. It will do the most advanced research, give us all the options, and so on. I hope you realize how the two of you have succeeded. A year after that, I discovered that the committee had indeed been appointed, and, as if it was something straight out of Gulliver's Travels, was comprised entirely of people who knew no English. They never met, and managed only to appoint one full-time researcher, a very bright woman, who told me that research meant that she had persuaded her superiors, the higher-ups, to allow her to buy a subscription to Time magazine and occasionally to buy the Herald Tribune. So much for a vigilant and alert leadership. I think both of us knew at the time, though I don't recall that we spoke about it, that something else was afoot, and that had nothing to do with the grassroots movements, but had to do with looking for a deal from the Americans that would keep Arafat and his followers in power, albeit as collaborators of the Israeli occupation. Eqbal was one of the few prophetic voices raised in criticism of the Oslo Awards, which he called a peace of the weak, while Arafat was constantly referring to it, embarrassingly, I'm sorry to say, as the peace of the braves, as if he was talking about the team, peace of the braves. Never content merely to curse the darkness, I recall that Eqbal spoke to me last fall at the time of the tunnel incidents about what, given his unenviable position, Arafat might do. I recall also that a few days later I wrote about Iqbal's proposal in one of my regular columns in the Arabic press. Who would have thought, by the way, that Eqbal and I would in our old age become journalists in the local media? But there you have it. We have both felt the need to address our own people and stop worrying about how we can get something in the appalling New York Times. Anyway, Eqbal proposed that rather than squander the moral legitimacy of his anti-settlement drive on fruitless street battles that would only lose him more women and men, which is in fact what happened, Arafat, he said, should lead a march to one of the settlements saying, "We are unarmed, we do not want to fight you, but we are going to fight your bricks and your stones." Instead, Arafat sat in one of his bunkers and ordered a general strike, which was predictably ignored, mostly by his people. A general strike that only hurt the Palestinians whose shops were forced shut and more businesses were lost. Let me now quote from a recent piece of Iqbal's, one that brilliantly summarizes the current situation with accuracy and with that innate fairness and definitiveness that is one of the hallmarks of Iqbal's writing. The Israeli government, he says, is now planning roads, major highways, and communication networks. They're already been built since this was written, which link the settlements to Israeli cities and ports and leave the Palestinian communities out. So you have these autonomous zones which are to be administered by the Palestinian Authority, over which this authority has no sovereignty, can't control the land, can't protect the water, and can't even set up industries without Israel's permission. So you have a series of Bantustans called Autonomous Palestinian Authority. Israel is absolving itself of responsibility for the occupied population while keeping the occupation. It's a brilliant scheme, and it is so far succeeding. Arafat is a party to this tragedy. What we are witnessing is the institutionalization of a system of exclusion, a fully contracted apartheid, separate municipalities, separate schools, separate health systems, a native economy, and an indigenous substratum on the margins of the Israeli state beneath the privileged settler society. This is a bad dream. A racialist utopia being constructed, ironically, by one of the most enlightened and historically humane people. And this with the agreement of a secular native leadership. If the trend holds during the next decade, Israel-Palestine shall look very much like what has just passed, South Africa of the apartheid era. There has been much talk in recent months of the fundamentalist Hamas successes and excesses, but rarely has a commentator noted the realities on which Hamas now feeds. I mustn't forget to say that having spent the past few weeks reading and thinking about Eqbal's contribution as activist, intellectual, scholar, teacher, and friend, how vast his range has been in his work. Like very few others, he has traversed oceans and boundaries with skill and an enviable sense of familiarity, never intimidated by expertise or professionalized jargon. He has honed his language into a marvelously lean instrument in which abstractions come to life and the concrete human experience of people all over the earth are rendered with liveliness and precision. Let me read you finally one extract from his introduction entitled Portent of a New Century. Where is it? There it is. Portent of a New Century. It's from the introduction to the Gulf Crisis Reader, edited by Phyllis Bennis. Note the remarkably fine deployment of generalizations, the consistent sense of irony, the regulated anger of his prose, and note also the way his sentences neither maunder nor cringe from harsh truths, and how each one contains aperçus that would be the subject of whole books by pompous authorities like Huntington or Brzezinski. The 20th has been a century most remarkable for its simultaneous capacity to promise hope and deliver disappointments. And as the end approaches, it seems to me that the century is ending in the same way in which it began. Renewed hopes of a just and peaceable world order are being overwhelmed by politicians and warriors whose political minds remain rooted in the past. For 300 years before the 20th century dawned, the world had been transforming. Transformation brought about by modern science, technology, and imperialism. It was through this age of capitalist and European expansion that a world system came to be dominated by the West, and the international market came to be controlled entirely for the West's benefits. This sounds rather benign, as though the free market was really free and worked merely to the advantage of the fittest. Far from it. Western domination was achieved by force, so widespread, institutionalized, and legitimized by religion and morality that to date the epistemology of this universal violence still shapes relations between the Western and non-Western worlds. As you read this, you feel that a voice of conviction and hope is addressing you, speaking with you rather than lecturing at or hectoring you.
And there, forgive me for not saying too much. I'll say only a few things. Work begins at home. I looked at the list of speakers there, and I looked at the size of this audience when I came in, and I said to myself, Jesus Christ, it's a bloody large audience of students and faculty members, some faculty members. And this goddamn speakers list doesn't seem to have much people from the universities. So, you obviously, consciously or unconsciously, have sensed or feel that there is something the universities are not doing that they ought to be doing. Well, it poses some very specific problems to you. If they are not doing what they ought to be doing, you damn well shouldn't be thinking of it or feeling it in your consciousness or unconsciousness. You damn well should sit down, form groups, work out what the hell they are not doing that they ought to be doing, and make up your plans and demand it. How many people in this Department of Political Science and how many people in the departments of sociology, psychology, and anthropology are talking in a way that is relevant? These people, they drive me crazy. In the night, I can't believe it. I come out of this university tradition. 1960s, I went to school in Princeton in 1950s. It was terrible. I was going to this Middle Eastern Studies and Political Science department. They had chalked out. It was unbelievable. These professors and students, their graduate students, had chalked out all the proclivities and revolutionary tendencies and social change proclivities of every goddamn fucking tribe in Africa, Middle East, and And Asia, they didn't know what the hell was happening to their own students. So that when in the 60s the student movement exploded on their stupid heads, they didn't know what was happening. They just didn't know what was happening.